Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into what researchers called the architecture of inequity. We're going to unpack the hard data behind cannabis prohibition and our modern criminal justice system. We want to see exactly how century-old policies built these massive structural barriers that are still standing today, and more importantly, what sociologists say is actually required to tear them down.
So, right off the bat, here is the core paradox at the heart of our source material today. Across the country, state-level commercial cannabis markets are absolutely booming, right? Yet, millions of people, predominantly from historically marginalized communities, are still serving what sociologists call invisible sentences. So why exactly is that happening?
Well, to really grasp this friction, we first need to look at just how much society has already shifted. According to a massive Pew Research Center survey cited in our research, a staggering 88% of U.S. adults now believe cannabis should be legal in some form. 55% support both medical and recreational use, and a mere 11% advocate for total prohibition. That is a massive, massive cultural transformation. But to understand why the criminal justice system hasn't fully caught up to that 88%, we kind of have to look backward.
Section 1. The Origins of Prohibition. A manufactured crisis.
Prior to federal restrictions, cannabis was actually just a legal, widely recognized medicinal herb sold right in pharmacies. So what changed? Well, in 1933, alcohol prohibition was repealed. That suddenly made the federal law enforcement infrastructure totally obsolete. Enter Harry Anslinger. As the commissioner of the newly formed Federal Bureau of Narcotics, he desperately needed a new target just to preserve his agency's funding and, frankly, its purpose. Anslinger, who had actually previously admitted cannabis wasn't a significant threat, completely pivoted. He basically weaponized sensationalism and yellow journalism to manufacture a crisis out of thin air.
The historical records we're examining neutrally report exactly how this played out. Exploiting the rampant prejudices of that era, Anslinger fabricated these wild narratives connecting this historically legal herb to violent crime, and he specifically targeted Black and Mexican men with completely unfounded claims. Let's be clear, this was not a medical consensus. It was bureaucratic self-preservation fueled by racial bias. And it worked. It secured the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, effectively framing cannabis not as a public health issue, but as a deliberately engineered, racialized threat.
Section 2. The Systemic Bias Filter. Equal behavior, unequal outcomes. Okay, bringing it into the modern era, empirical research consistently shows us that Black, Hispanic, and white individuals consume cannabis at nearly identical rates. The inputs, the actual human behaviors, are exactly equal. But as those behaviors pass through this filter of systemic bias and hyper-surveillance in historically marginalized neighborhoods, the outcomes become drastically disproportionate. Historically, Black and Latino individuals have faced vastly higher rates of arrest, conviction, and incarceration for simple possession. It's the same behavior, just penalized entirely differently.
Section 3. Anatomy of Invisible Sentences. The Permanent Punishment.
Now, the crucial point here is that the punishment doesn't magically end when court fines are paid or when probation is served. A criminal conviction for simple possession transforms into a permanent, invisible brick wall. It actively blocks people from basic life necessities. We're talking about an employment blockade that locks people out of living wage jobs, a housing blockade that denies them access to stable tenant agreements, and an education blockade that restricts access to higher education funding.
So why is this barrier so incredibly impenetrable? Well, it comes down to the 90% rule. Basically, 9 out of 10 modern American employers use formal pre-employment background checks as a primary screen. Think about what you should really take away from this. A minor, historical drug offense creates an artificial, structural barrier to getting hired. When you multiply that effect across entire neighborhoods that were hyper-policed, it literally depresses the overall earning potential and significantly widens the racial wealth gap. It just strips away a person's basic ability to be an independent provider.
Section 4. The Economic Friction. Hypocritical Commercial Markets.
And all of this builds into a really glaring economic paradox today. On one hand, you have the commercial beneficiaries, these large multi-state corporate operators navigating complex regulations to generate billions of dollars in fully legal taxable profits. But on the flip side, you have these systemic victims. These are individuals from historically marginalized communities with past convictions for the exact same substance, legally barred from participating in or even benefiting from this massive new market. The sociological sources are quick to point out just how stark and hypocritical this divergence really is.
Section 5. True Justice Reform. The Sociological Blueprint for Equity.
Before we jump into the solution, we have to acknowledge the ongoing damage to public safety. Decades of aggressive, disproportionate policing in marginalized neighborhoods fosters this deep, deep institutional cynicism. Because when a community realizes laws are being selectively enforced based on racial biases, trust fractures. People become far less likely to report actual violent crimes or cooperate with the police. In fact, recent empirical evidence from Dr. Meinhofer in 2026 demonstrates that even as overall arrest numbers fall today, proportional racial disparities in cannabis enforcement frequently persist. Passing a new law doesn't just magically erase ingrained practices overnight.
So how do we actually fix it? By shifting from a retributive to a restorative policy. Passive legalization, which is the retributive status quo, basically says do the crime, do the time, and leaves that permanent record totally intact, ensuring high unemployment and damaged community trust. But true social equity? That requires restorative action. It requires actively clearing the social record, which removes those artificial economic barriers and shifts the focus back to genuine public safety and stabilizing these communities.
The specific tool researchers say is needed for this restorative action is automatic retroactive expungement. Think of it like a heavy-duty pair of bolt cutters. It physically severs the chain connecting a historical, racially biased drug offense to lifetime economic disenfranchisement. And the word automatic is absolutely key here. It officially breaks the connection without forcing people to navigate expensive, complex legal hurdles on their own. The sociologists in our source material emphasize that this isn't just an optional policy preference, it's an absolute social necessity.
Which brings us to the complete blueprint. Synthesizing everything we've covered in this explainer, true social equity really requires 3 pillars. First, commercial legalization to end the ongoing criminalization. Second, and this is the missing piece for a lot of states, automatic expungement to actively repair the historical structural damage. And third, community reinvestment to redefine public safety around economic stabilization rather than just punitive surveillance. Simply legalizing cannabis while ignoring past criminal records leaves the entire underlying architecture of systemic racism fully intact. As researchers point out, tearing down the entire blueprint of prohibition is what's required to build true social equity.
I want to leave you with a final thought to reflect on as we wrap up today's explainer. Based on all the data, the history, and the systemic barriers we've just unpacked, can true legality truly exist if we don't clear the systemic injustices of the past? It's a question that challenges us to look beyond just consumer markets and consider what real justice actually requires. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking the big questions.